eventually others that wrap around the backside. This particular groove travels between the right atrium and the right ventricle. Yeah, I said it, the right ventricle. The right ventricle forms the anterior-most wall of the heart, faces forward. So this groove can be called the right AV, atrioventricular sulcus. The sulcus is the groove. What's interesting is that the right coronary artery originates from the aorta and travels down this right AV groove. There it is right there in red, right coronary artery. And for that reason, some folks call this the right coronary sulcus instead of the right AV sulcus. This would be the left interventricular sulcus. It's inter, I-N-T-E-R. That means between ventricles. The left interventricular sulcus. It sits between the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And notice the left ventricle is what contributes to the apex of the heart. Okay? The vessel that travels within this sulcus is the LAD, which stands for left anterior descending coronary artery. Some folks give this artery that travels down toward the apex a different name, like call it the anterior interventricular artery. Nobody calls it that in real life. It's called the LAD, the left anterior descending coronary artery. Now, there's another groove. Here, you just see really a piece of the left atrium here. The left atrium is mostly posterior, so it's just this very tip of the auricle of the left atrial appendage that projects forward. Well, there's another groove called the left coronary sulcus that travels between the left atrium and left ventricle to the back. So let's name the chambers. You have the right atrium, and this ear-like part is called the right auricle, or you can call it the right atrial appendage. You have the right ventricle. You have the left atrium, and this part here would be called the left auricle or left atrial appendage. Okay? And if we say here, this is the left ventricle. Now, the right ventricle, when it pumps up, the right ventricle is the pulmonary circuit pump. It's going to take unoxygenated blood and pump it right next door to the lungs. So the right ventricle tends to be a thinner walled chamber because it doesn't need to generate as much force to pump blood right next door. Okay? But it's going to pump blood into this pulmonary trunk that's going to bifurcate into a left pulmonary artery and a right pulmonary artery. Notice the right pulmonary artery is traveling underneath the aortic arch. And so these branches are going to carry unoxygenated blood to the lungs where the blood picks up oxygen. The pulmonary trunk, or the main pulmonary artery, is the anterior-most great vessel. It shows here the ascending aorta right next to it. But this depiction is not quite accurate. The ascending aorta is actually posterior to the main pulmonary artery. It makes it look like they're sitting side by side, but it actually sits more like this. This one's in front of this one. Okay. So we said the right ventricle is going to pump blood up into the pulmonary trunk, which is then going to shunt it either to the right or left lung. The left ventricle is the more powerful of the two pumps. It's called the systemic pump. It's going to pump blood throughout the rest of the body. To the vertex of the head, down to the bottom of the feet. and with enough force so that once the blood reaches those parts, it can return all the way back to the heart, against gravity in some cases. So the left ventricle has to generate more force. So if you look at its wall, the myocardium is much thicker. So the left ventricular free wall is much thicker than the right ventricular free wall. What else can we say about this? Well, the left ventricle is pumping blood, and here, into the aorta. This is the ascending aorta. And then when the branches start coming off, this is the aortic arch. Back in the day, we said that there were 3 major branches originating from the aortic arch. And the way you remember it is broccoli cheese soup or Bowl Championship Series. Yeah, BCS. So Ruth, the B, brachiosephallic artery. The C is the left common carotid, and the S is the left subclavian artery. Now, brachiocephalic literally means arm head. Brachio is arm, cephalic is head. It's the arm head artery. So this brachiocephalic trunk, after it originates from the arch, it splits. The branch that goes up into the head and neck is the right common carotid. The branch that's moving into the right upper extremity is the right what? Subclavian. Whereas the left common carotid and left subclavian don't originate from an arch. They come directly from the aortic arch. They don't originate from a trunk. They come directly from the aortic arch. Is this all coming back to you now? It's good stuff. Every once in a while I'll have a dream, and I'll be dreaming about this stuff. Like the vessels that come off the common carotid or the external. I mean, it's good stuff. Yeah. One thing you have to learn, like for instance, when you're studying stuff you don't really want to study, okay, is in your mind you have to do a 180. You have to tell yourself, I'm gonna love this stuff. You have to play mind games. And I can't get enough of this. Yeah, that's what you gotta do. That's how you have to roll. All right. Can't get enough of that picture. All right. Now what we've done here is we've kind of sliced the heart in half. Taking kind of a frontal plane section here to look inside. In this picture, you can see that the pulmonary trunk sits anterior to the ascending aorta. This is more correct. Okay. So we said that there are 3 vessels that deliver blood to the right atrium. And this is unoxygenated blood. It's the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, and the one you don't see is the coronary sinus. When blood accumulates within the right atrium, during the diastolic phase of the cardiac cycle, this valve opens and the blood gets shunted into the right ventricle. Okay. At the same time, blood from the lungs is returning to the left atrium. So whereas we have 3 vessels that empty into the right atrium, you have 4 that empty into the left atrium. We said the right atrium is filling with unoxygenated blood. The left atrium is going to fill with oxygenated blood from the lungs. So you have 2 right pulmonary veins and 2 left pulmonary veins, all of which empty into the left atrium. That blood is oxygenated, meaning it's bright red. So if you ever see models, they always color code the left atrium as being red, the right atrium is blue. Unoxygenated versus oxygenated. Now, from the left atrium during diastole, when the ventricle is relaxing, this valve the mitral valve opens and blood is shunted into the left ventricle. So these two valves that sit between, respectively, the right and the left atria and ventricles, these are called AV valves, atrioventricular valves, because of their position. AV valves have three components. They have cusp, or leaflets. They have these cord-like structures called chordae tendineae, and then the chordae tendineae attach to papillary muscles. So all AV valves, tricuspid and the mitral, have all three components. Now, the tricuspid valve has three cusps, or leaflets. The mitral valve only has two. So back in the day, people called the mitral valve the bicuspid valve because it only has two leaflets. Nobody uses that terminology anymore. We all simply call it the mitral valve. If someone were to say in a cath lab, the bicuspid valve, everybody would look. What you talking about? Because nobody uses that term anymore. It's like saying that Caroline is a hobo. Like a lot of you don't even know what a hobo is. Okay? Because we don't use that term anymore. Or I could say Caroline's a vagabond. And y'all say, what does that mean? Well, it's a hobo. But again, we don't use that term anymore. Now, if we say she's a tramp, we all understand what that means. Okay? Because that's a more modern term. Okay? They used to show hobos. These are homeless people walking around with a sack with their clothes on the end of a stick. Y'all get that image in your head? Okay, I divert. I digress. Okay, so you have four valves in the heart. These two are AV valves. They open during diastole, allowing the ventricles to fill with blood. When the AV valves are open, the other two valves, called semilunar valves, are closed. So, on the right side, the semilunar valve that sits at the base of the pulmonary trunk is called the pulmonic valve. The semilunar valve that sits at the base of the ascending aorta is the aortic valve. Both of these valves have three cusps. But they do not have any chordae tendineae and do not have any papillary muscles attached. These are just extensions of a double-layered endothelium extending into the lumen of the vessel. Okay. So, we said that these semilunar valves are closed during diastole, and the ventricles are relaxed. When the ventricles go to contract during systole, these valves have to open to allow blood to be pumped from the right side into the pulmonary trunk, from the left side into the aorta. So the semilunar valves open during systole, and the AV valves close during systole. So, for instance, let's take here the pulmonic valve. As the right ventricle pumps, generates pressure, there's enough force that it pops open this valve and blood is ejected into the pulmonary trunk. As the right ventricle begins to relax, this blood begins to move retrograde, fills up these pockets, and forces close the valve during diastole. So by closing the semilunar valves, it doesn't allow blood to leak back into the right ventricle. Or the same thing on the left side, to leak back into the left ventricle. So again, systole, semilunar valves open, AV valves close. Yeah, during systole, this pressure generated within the ventricles is going to force close these AV valves so that blood doesn't leak back into the atrium. When we listen to the heart, and I think we've all been there, where we've kind of just listened to our heart. Yes? We've all listened to our heart. Okay. And what do you hear? What does one hear? Anybody? The beating of the heart. What does it sound like? A lot of people love dove. Like that's how people always describe it. Love dove, love dove, love dove. There's two sounds. The first sound is called the S1 heart sound. The second one's called the S2. S1 is lower pitched and more sustained. The second heart sound is higher pitched and more discreet. Did y'all follow that? That was an impression. And so it begs the question, what in the world causes those sounds? It's the closure of valves. Okay. S1 marks the onset of systole. When the ventricles begin to contract, these AV valves, tricuspid microvalves, are force closed, generating that first heart sound, the S1. Okay? And so following S1, blood is being ejected, because just as these valves close, the semilunar valves open, allowing injection of blood into the great vessels. Okay? Now, as soon as the ventricles begin to undergo diastole, relax, this blood all of a sudden moves back retrograde, forcing close these semilunar valves. That creates the S2 sound that marks the onset of diastole. Now, during diastole, with the onset of diastole, the AV valves open. Yeah, just it's the opposites. No one's listened to your heart before. Yeah. What was neat? I think Josie, you were there in the physical diagnosis class. One of the students brought her mother who had a hole in her heart in the interventricular septum. So it created a murmur, a swishing sound, in addition to S1, S2. So we brought her to the lab and we did an echo, and you could see blood flowing from one side to the other, correlating with the physical findings. Cool.
That was fascinating.
Yeah. All right. What is this vessel here? Yeah. I saw a cartoon where it was kind of an image of the heart, and this vessel was talking to this vessel, and it was asking, no, this vessel was talking to this vessel, and was asking what makes you so superior. That was a little anatomical humor. Y'all get that? Yeah. Superior. Brachiocephalic, left common carotid vessel clear. Just throwing that out there. Does that change anything? All right, so, yeah, this is my wife's slide. Okay, I said all of this stuff already. Okay, the only thing I forgot to mention under remember, rat and lamb. Okay, rat and lamb. Go back. All right. Between the right atrium and right ventricle, rat. Right atrium tricuspid. That means this is the tricuspid valve. On the left side, left atrium mitral. Now, you say, well, lamb is spelled L-A-M-B. The B is silent because we no longer use the term bicuspid. That's kind of a little deep in mind. I made that up. I didn't. It works. What's interesting is as you go further in the studies, you'll learn that you're going to make up all kinds of mnemonics. Okay? Like, for instance, somebody may have a mnemonic here for the vitamins. I'm trying to remember what student that was. She graduated. She lived on the North Shore. Her boyfriend's name is Cody. Who am I talking about?
Kayla.
Kayla? No.
Oh,
Macy.
Macy.
So we're talking about the vitamins. Okay. So the fat soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K. So Macy's little group made up the mnemonic, Amy don't even know she fat. So Amy's apparently fat, and she don't even know it.
Mm-hmm.
So fat, A, D, E, and K. That's a good little mnemonic. And it doesn't really matter, like, for instance, if you learn the 12 cranial nerves, there are lots of good cranial nerve mnemonics. They all begin with O. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It helps you to remember. These are memory aids. In anatomy and in physiology, you need those kind of memory aids. Okay, so that was that slide. Okay? Valves. The ventricles pump blood in the vessels through the semilunar valves. The right ventricle pumps blood through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary trunk. The left ventricle pumps blood through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta. The semilunar valves are not attached to capillary muscles. No, that's only true for the AV valves. The cusps are crescent shaped, like the moon. Hence the term semilunar. Now, the right and left sides of the heart represent two separate circuits. The right side is the pump for the pulmonary circuit. In other words, the right ventricle pumps blood into the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle pumps blood into the systemic circuit. All right. So here, the right heart is going to pump blood to the lungs. This is blue, it's unoxygenated. The blood's going to pick up oxygen in the lungs. It's going to return to the left heart via the pulmonary veins. The left ventricle is going to pump blood into the systemic circuit where it travels to all of the tissues except for the lungs. And then once this blood gives up its oxygen at the level of capillaries, it becomes unoxygenated and then returns to the right heart. And we repeat this cycle again and again and again. For most of us, we pass blood through this circuit at least 60 to 100 times a minute. Isn't that crazy? Yeah, some craziness. All right. This is the circulation of blood through the heart. In other words, when blood returns to the right atrium, what route does it take? Well, it passes through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, the blood passes through the pulmonic valve into the pulmonary trunk, which then bifurcates into the right left pulmonary arteries. These carry the oxygenated blood to the lungs, okay, where it gets oxygenated, and then returns via the pulmonary veins. The left atrium. It passes from the left atrium to the mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then pumps it through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta, the aortic arch, descending aorta, which includes the thoracic and the abdominal parts. Okay. Remember that arteries are vessels that carry blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood toward the heart. These definitions have nothing to do with whether the blood is oxygenated or not. For example, the pulmonary arteries carry blood away from the heart, but yet it's unoxygenated. I'm very curious about something. We've been talking here for now. How long have we been talking? An hour and a half?
Just an hour.
An hour. Okay, so let's pretend we've been talking for an hour. Okay. Do you guys remember most of this stuff? Yeah. Yeah, you know why?
As you talk.
Thank you, good teaching, yes. I'll tell you what's interesting. So, Maureen O'Sullivan took I was telling my other class, she took the MCAT and she got an unbelievably good score. It was like in the top 10% of the country. Okay, really, really good. And so she wrote with her scores and her breakdowns, and she said, she was shocked. And she went on to tell me all about what was in the MCAT. She said, remember how we spent all that time on the renin-angiotensin system? She said there were like 3 different questions, and these are like sections on the renin-angiotensin pathways. She said, I'm glad I had memorized it. You know, and by the way, when you take the MCAT, you don't know what's going to be on there. But I was happy to hear that the renin-angiotensin pathway was there. So you just don't know. But we did, the graduating class from last year, I was telling the other class, did extremely well. Haley Lothridge got into OT school at LSU, which is a real accomplishment. Ann Murphy got into multiple PT schools. It was really, really a good class. Next class, when we come back here on Tuesday, we're going to spend the lab dissecting. It will be a graded dissection. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But here's a heart that's been opened up. Okay? And when you open the heart, one of the things you have to do to identify which chamber is which is to look at the free wall. If I didn't have this attached and I was just looking at this half here, I would say, okay, this free wall is thicker. So this has to belong to the left ventricle rather. Whereas over here, the free wall is thinner, this has to be the right ventricle. And that will correspond to the right ventricle here, the left ventricle here. They've simply opened this up like a book. Okay? Now, if this is the right ventricle, that means that this AV valve has to be the tricuspid valve. Okay? And we're seeing one cusp, second cusp is the third cusp. This is the septal cusp here. This has to be the right atrium. And you can see the superior vena cava emptying into it. Whereas this has to be the left ventricle, meaning this is the mitral valve, 2 cusp. Okay. Here's the left atrium. The left ventricle pumps blood past the aortic valve here. This is a semilunar valve. Here's one of the cusps. It looks like a crescent moon. But you have 3 of them. Here's 1.5, here's the other 1.5. That makes 3. If you look at the left atrium, you see the left pulmonary veins and the right pulmonary veins emptying in. Here's the openings of the coronary arteries. This right here is on the right side, so this is the right coronary ostium. This is the left coronary ostium. Ostium means opening. Let me show you something. So I'm just drawing the left ventricle here, and here's the aorta, okay? Now, off the right side of the aortic wall is going to come the right coronary artery. Here's the aortic valve right here. And then off the left side of the wall is the left coronary artery. So, right coronary artery, and this is actually called the left main coronary artery. So the opening into the aorta is called the ostium. So here's the right coronary ostium, here's the left main coronary ostium. Now, we said that the right travels down the right coronary sulcus. The left main bifurcates. It gives off the LAD, which travels down the anterior interventricular sulcus. And then it gives rise to the circumflex, the left circumflex, which travels around the back of the heart. Yeah. So when people think of the coronary arteries, they think of three: the right, the LAD, and the left circumflex. But remember that the left circumflex comes from a common trunk of pain. When people have coronary artery disease, it means they have blockages in one or more of these three vessels. Now, sometimes a person will have a blockage in the left main like this. They'll come in with severe chest pain and hypotension. And you'll bring them directly to the cardiac cath lab, and you see that they have a high-grade blockage in the left main. We call that type of blockage a widowmaker. A widowmaker. Why do you think we call that a widowmaker?
It kills instantly.
Yeah, because it's a good chance that person's going to die. Yeah. And so their wife or their husband becomes a widow. Hence the term widowmaker. It's a very picturesque term. Yeah. Like, you have to be careful. I remember both, all right, so I did a fellowship at Oxford, and so you have residents under you. And then later, when I spent some time as a staff person at Oxford, but then I went on my own Turo. And in Turo, I had some cardiology fellows from Tulane who trained under me. They rotated through Turo. And I was doing a cardiac cath, and the patient's sedated, but they're awake. And so we were injecting the left main, and it was clear that the person was sitting on a high-grade blockage in the left main. And the fellow shouted out, "Oh, that's a widowmaker." And the patient looks up and he says, "Widowmaker?" You have to be careful what you say. We had to make up a story. It's like, you know, when you're in on surgery, or particularly if you're in on a procedure, like a cardiac cath, where a patient's sedated but they're not sleeping, you never want to say the term "oops." Like, you may make a mistake, but don't say "oops." It causes unnecessary anxiety. When people say "oops," okay, I'll tell you another funny story. Is that at some point I was like a senior fellow, and I had a junior fellow who was just training under me, who was doing like an angioplasty or something. And so it was 3